The Trump administration has taken its fight over sweeping global tariffs to the Supreme Court, escalating a legal battle that could reshape the boundaries of presidential power for years to come. The administration is seeking to overturn a lower court ruling that declared the tariffs illegal, arguing that the decision threatens to undermine the executive branch's ability to respond to global economic challenges. On September 4, 2025, the Justice Department filed an urgent petition, asking the justices to review the case on an expedited timeline, emphasizing the far-reaching impact of the outcome. The administration argues that its America First tariffs, ranging from 10 to 50% on imports from nearly every country, are essential to its economic and foreign policy agenda, and are designed to protect American industries and jobs from what it calls unfair foreign competition. The legal battle is a fundamental test of presidential authority. Can a president unilaterally impose such broad economic measures, or must Congress play a more direct role in shaping trade policy? The dispute centers on Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to justify the tariffs, citing national emergencies like the trade deficit and the fentanyl crisis as urgent threats to the country's security and prosperity. Solicitor General John Sauer warned in the petition that the president's power to conduct foreign policy and protect national security is at risk, and that limiting this authority could have serious consequences for future administrations. The Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, is set to hear arguments as early as November, making this one of the most consequential and closely watched cases of the term. The outcome will affect everything from consumer prices and the cost of everyday goods to the stability of international alliances and the future of global trade agreements. For businesses and foreign governments, the court's decision is a source of both hope and anxiety, as it could reshape the rules of international commerce and set new precedents for executive power. The legal arguments are set. Now, the world waits for the highest court's response, knowing that the decision will reverberate far beyond America's borders. The stakes for presidential power and global trade have never been higher, and the outcome of this case could define the limits of executive authority for generations to come. The Supreme Court appeal comes on the heels of a significant and highly publicized defeat for the administration in the lower courts, setting the stage for a high-stakes legal showdown. On August 29, 2025, the Federal Circuit ruled by a decisive 7-4 margin that Trump's tariffs exceeded the authority Congress granted under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. The court emphasized that regulating commerce and imposing tariffs is fundamentally a congressional power, not a presidential one, reaffirming the separation of powers at the heart of the Constitution. The majority opinion made clear that IEEPA does not provide the explicit and unambiguous authorization needed for such sweeping economic action, especially when it impacts the entire nation's trade policy. The administration's broad interpretation of IEEPA, the court found, would effectively create a new presidential power that Congress never intended to grant, raising concerns about executive overreach. Although the appeals court granted a temporary stay on its ruling, the legal foundation for the tariffs remains fragile and could collapse entirely if the Supreme Court affirms the lower court's decision. President Trump quickly denounced the decision, calling it a partisan attack on his administration, and warned of dire economic consequences for American industries if the tariffs are ultimately struck down. For the coalition of small businesses and states challenging the tariffs, the ruling was a major victory, reinforcing their argument that the president had overstepped legal bounds and restoring faith in the checks and balances of government. The decision draws a clear and unmistakable line. Even in times of emergency, presidential authority has limits set by Congress and the Constitution, ensuring no branch becomes too powerful. Now, with the nation watching closely, the Supreme Court must decide exactly where those limits lie and how far executive power can reach. The administration's defense relies on a broad reading of IEEPA, arguing it gives the president tools to confront threats to national security and the economy. They claim the trade deficit and the fentanyl crisis qualify as national emergencies, justifying the tariffs as essential instruments of statecraft. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent insists that removing this power would undermine the president's ability to protect American interests. The administration argues tariffs are leverage to pressure other nations and safeguard the U.S. from unfair trade practices. This marks a dramatic expansion of IEEPA's traditional use, which was for targeted sanctions, not global tariffs. The Justice Department warns that courts should defer to the president's judgment on national security. At stake, they argue, is the ability of any president to respond flexibly to evolving threats. Challengers to the tariffs, a coalition of small businesses, industry groups, and states, argue the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to impose tariffs and regulate foreign commerce. They believe that allowing the executive branch to take such sweeping action undermines the careful balance of powers established by the founders, and could have far-reaching consequences for American democracy. They say IEPA was never meant to authorize sweeping trade policy changes, only targeted sanctions. According to their legal teams, the law's original intent was to address specific national emergencies, not to serve as a blank check for broad economic measures that impact millions of Americans and countless businesses. The challengers invoke the major questions doctrine, arguing that for actions of vast economic significance, Congress must speak with unmistakable clarity. They insist that only Congress, through explicit legislation, can authorize such major shifts in trade policy, not the president acting alone. Plaintiffs, including importers and retailers, claim the tariffs are inflicting severe economic harm, forcing layoffs and price hikes. Many businesses say they are struggling to survive, with some facing closure, and workers across the country are feeling the impact in their paychecks and job security. They argue the tariffs are an unlawful burden imposed without legal justification. For them, the stakes are not just legal but deeply personal, affecting livelihoods, families, and entire communities. Ultimately, they ask the Supreme Court to affirm the lower court's ruling and rein in executive overreach. They hope the court will restore the constitutional limits on presidential power and protect the rights of those most affected. Allowing the president to use emergency powers for tariffs, they warn, would set a dangerous precedent and bypass Congress's constitutional role. Such a move, they argue, could open the door to future abuses of power, eroding the checks and balances at the heart of American government. Their plea: protect the separation of powers and keep the power of the purse with the legislative branch, ensuring that no single branch can unilaterally reshape the nation's economic destiny. The Supreme Court's decision will have immediate, far-reaching economic consequences. The tariffs at issue are double-digit duties on goods from major trading partners, reshaping supply chains and raising costs for manufacturers and consumers. If upheld, the tariffs would cement a new era of presidentially driven trade wars. If struck down, the government could owe billions in refunds to businesses, and recent trade deals could be thrown into chaos. The uncertainty is already challenging for American companies who face higher costs and tough choices about pricing and competitiveness. A clear ruling would provide much-needed certainty, but will create winners and losers. The impact extends globally, affecting trade relationships and alliances. The world is watching to see if the U.S. will double down on aggressive economic measures or return to traditional trade norms. The political stakes are as high as the economic ones. For President Trump, a Supreme Court win would validate his America First agenda and embolden his use of executive power. A loss would be a public rebuke, weakening his political standing and fueling criticism of his leadership. The decision will also shape Congress's response, either prompting new limits on presidential power or relieving lawmakers of pressure to act. The Supreme Court's handling of the case will be scrutinized for signs of partisanship, especially with its conservative majority. A principled, constitutional ruling could enhance the court's legitimacy. But a decision seen as politically motivated could erode public trust in the judiciary. The outcome will reverberate through American politics and governance. At its core, this case is about the scope of presidential power in the modern era. The Supreme Court's ruling will likely hinge on the major questions doctrine, which demands clear congressional authorization for actions of vast significance. If the court strikes down the tariffs, it will set a precedent, limiting executive authority and reasserting Congress's role in major policy decisions. If the administration prevails, the president gains a powerful new tool for economic statecraft, shifting the balance of power toward the executive. The decision will define the legal landscape for trade and presidential power for years to come. The justices are not just deciding on tariffs. They are drawing the boundaries of American governance.